When I was here before any of the programs started and had to do a sound check with the microphone, they asked me to read, oh, I forgot, from Whispers. Okay, so let's just sort of start over again. I have Whispers from Eternity. I mean, no terrible thing will happen if we forget, but we might as well remember. But the one I was reading earlier was just so grim. For some reason, when I chose it, that was the mood I was in, but it doesn't feel right now. Now I have to remember, yes, here it is. Number 61. In the summer days of life, teach me to gather honey from the flowers of all spiritual qualities that blossom in the garden of truthful souls. I will store the perfume of forgiveness in the honeycomb of my heart, the lotus fragrance of humility, myrrh-scented devotion, the rare honey of all soul qualities. And even though the snowflakes of wintry experiences and earthly separations whirl about me, I shall seek thee in the honeycomb of my heart, where often I have found thee, stealing the stored honey of my devotion. Wherever thou hast come, in every place hallowed by thy feet, I will lie touching thy footprints. Ah, there alone will I find a place of true safety. You know, well, you don't know because I'm about to tell you, but I will tell you in just a moment. In the one I was going to read, which I'm not going to read all of, but it says, I've learned to love thy dance of destruction, for what is destroyed is my own ignorance. Thou hast shattered again and again with the war dance of destruction. I mean, here in the same book, you know, it's just that far apart in the pages. On one hand, he's writing about it so fiercely, and on this hand, he's writing about it so sweetly. The war dance of Divine Mother hovering in the footprints of thy devotion. And it's the same guy, and it's the same story. When I was in India one year, when we were first taking our pilgrimage journeys there, and we ended up in the timing of our trip, which we would take in the fall, we would take 30 people, almost all from America, almost all going to India for the first time. The first time I led that trip was the first time I went to India. I would, find out from the guide here what was happening and then act very authoritative over here, and I knew the spiritual principles. I just didn't know where we were going or anything about it. So when we were in Calcutta during the Kali Puja time, which is sometime in September or October, a 9-day festival or whatever it was, and the way it would work there, and I think it still does, is the neighborhoods would get together and they would pool their resources and their energy, and then they would make big temporary altars to Divine Mother in the form of Kali, these beautiful statues. Now, Kali is the war dance of destruction. She's the one that is always pointed out by Christian missionaries to show how barbaric the Indians are, because she has a sword in her hand and her tongue is out and she wears a garland of skulls and her hair is wild. Just everything that the neat Western mind. I mean, they never think that the symbol that they have is this man hanging on a cross, which is about as morbid and terrible as you can imagine, but they just accept that and then find something odd about Kali. But if you're not raised with it, it's a bit strange. And the way it would work in the city, which was quite crowded, is that there would just be like a place, a sidewalk place in front of someone's house or store, and they would build these big altars. Sometimes they were quite large, and all of these different statues of Kali. Well, we were going through the streets of Calcutta. The context is long since forgotten, and it was crowded, and we were doing something that caused us to sort of more or less be standing, but because of the crowds, there was this constant movement, and I was just backing up a little and sort of pulling the group back and like this. And all of a sudden, I sort of bumped into something, and I turned around, and I was just right flush against one of those altars. And I turned around, and there she was, just like huge, and with the sword and the skulls and all the artist's tremendous effort. And it startled. It didn't so much frighten me, it just startled me. And I just sort of looked at her, and my question was, who are you? Like, what is this? Because it's so far out of the Western context, but I'm not any more Western than I am Indian. None of us are. It also was profoundly familiar, even though very exotic. Of course, I was younger then. It was many years ago. But it was sort of like staring at her virtually nose to nose. She answered me. And one hand is holding the sword that's just going to cut us to bits, and the other hand is extended in blessing. And when it's done well artistically, which this lady was, she was done really well, it was all there. And then you could see the garland of skulls reminding us about death, and all the energy of all her limbs, the way she's moving like this. And she sort of was leaning over me like this, saying, don't you just recognize, isn't this what life is like? With one hand, we're cut to pieces with a sword, and simultaneously, we're blessed. Because it's just so different. It's just so completely different than what we think it is. And all that's really being changed is our preconceptions. Where the human ego is so persuasive. It just persuades us that what it thinks is what's true, and then we feel in some weird way slightly violated when what we think is true turns out not to be true. But where did the whole thing start? Well, the Old Testament tells us it started out there with Adam and Eve, who just had this idea of what they were supposed to do, and God gave them parameters, and they broke the parameters. You can do everything but this, and they decided to do this, because that is sort of how the human mind also works, especially, just tell them not to, and they will. In Sri Yukteswar's few aphorisms that he told Yogananda about his early life, when Master said, tell me something about your early life, my mother tried to frighten me, Sri Yukteswar says, with stories of this ghost down in the basement closet or whatever it was, because she was trying to deter him from going there. And he just marched right down there and opened the door and was quite disappointed that the monster, the ghoul, the ghost, whatever it was not there. And of course he puts it out, look fear in the face, and it will cease to trouble you. But just as soon as she told him not to, that was when he decided he was going to go do it, just like that. So allegorically, somehow God said to Adam and Eve, don't do it, and so they did, just like that. And then, as Swami describes himself, when he first tried to get interested in spirituality and started at the first page of the Bible in the Old Testament, and I think the way he puts it in The Path is he said, Adam and Eve were told by God not to, taste of the tree of knowledge. And because they did, he said, they were driven out of the garden and condemned to live like witless serfs for the rest of their lives. And Swami thought this was not a persuasive religious argument as far as he was concerned. It caused him instead just to shut the book. He said, maybe there's a deep meaning there, which later he learned from Master that the allegory, and often the allegory is put in terms of sexuality or the second chakra, but the way Swami writes it so simply in this book, the tree of knowledge is the spine. The tree of knowledge of good and evil is not sexuality, which is, my gosh, how narrow can we be in our concept of things? It's just the fact that there is good and evil. In the perfect Garden of Eden, all we're doing is we're just living in attunement with the divine. We're living in the oneness, but then we begin to become active and curious, and our energy goes outward, and we suddenly are living in the world of duality. And that's what good and evil represents, is that once we move away from our central understanding, then we're caught in this world of duality. And it's the process. Master uses a phrase. He uses the phrase, he says, what happens to us over many incarnations is that this never-ending duality, what happens is we find ourselves in a state of anguishing monotony. And it's a extraordinary 2 words in the English language that Master just felt to put together, was inspired to put together. I don't know how it translates, because that book is in many other languages, but the meaning of those words in English just grip you. Because even tragedy, even great disappointment, there's an intensity to it. Monotony is not the word we think of. But what really wears us down spiritually is the anguishing monotony of it. It's just, here I am again. And Master said the reason the child cries when it takes its first breath, and this is Master's words, is because all of a sudden it says, oh, here I am again. Here I am again in the material world, and this whole cycle is all going to start over. And it is the anguishing monotony of it that we can never find that satisfaction and fulfillment that we know is ours by right. If we didn't know it was ours by right, it would just be the way things are. And before people really come on to the spiritual path, when they're just living their lives, the anguishing monotony hasn't set in yet. This is just the way things are. It doesn't deeply cross their minds that things could be different. So there isn't that impelling sense to find the answer. But somehow, somewhere, and it's over this cycle of time where we live through this again and again and again and again. And the anguishing monotony of it, coupled with this awakening sense that there is an alternative. There is an alternative to this. And then all of a sudden we meet saints, we read scripture, we find all these realities, that begin to say to us, there is a way out. We get the knowledge of good and evil. And with that, we understand that the solution is the separation from it altogether. And again, Swami writes, that people think then, where is the happiness in that? Where is the happiness in singularity? Where is the happiness in stillness and oneness? And they're just simply not interested. I was talking to a friend about a mutual acquaintance of ours who had gotten themselves in so much trouble over the course of life, financial loss, personal loss, loss of freedom, even being imprisoned. Just all, it was a very adventurous life, not the one that I would normally live, but that would be the life that they lived. And my friend had to say that our mutual acquaintance liked that life. That the rest of us looked at it as like, I wouldn't want to do that. But for them, it was stimulating, it was exciting. There was no anguishing monotony to it. Something was always going to happen. And that's how many people just think about it. There was an acquaintance, and when he was mildly interested in our path until he found out there was no sex in heaven. And it was just like, how could it be heaven? It was just simple as that. And well, okay, see you again next incarnation. I mean, there was just no place to go. Swamiji was talking once in India, as it happened. He was just giving a satsang, very informal. And he explained it this way. He said, because creation is so complex and ever-shifting entertainment, it looks like this today and that tomorrow, and I was young yesterday and I'm old now, and now people are dying, and now just all these different things happening, and it just endlessly ramified. I mean, this is just one tiny little spot. We can get on planes and trains and buses and walking, and we can just go into cultures that are so entirely and completely different than this one. Everything, just endlessly. And every face is different. Every karmic story is its own story. I mean, when we stop and think about it, it's literally overwhelming. So we naturally think that the creator of all this must be the most complex of all. It's just the only way we can think about it. And then we come to this weird thing of duality, where it's all just movement. This is how Swami describes it. It's all just movement from the Om. The Om just starts ramification in all different directions. The pendulum just starts swinging like this. But the closer we come to the center of our own being, the closer we come to the simple truth of our point of origin, far from agitating more and more, it goes just the opposite, doesn't it? I mean, all of us at some point, whether out in nature or in a moment of tremendous love in this world, or in the silence of meditation, in the thrill of creative expression, music, art, whatever it might be, we just find that everything becomes far from being more and more complicated. It gets so simple. And the simplicity of it is because we have come back from all of that and are standing, sitting, being. There's no physicality to it. We just are. We just are in that fundamental reality, that a tiny bubble of laughter, I am become the sea of mirth itself. Master ends his whole poem about cosmic consciousness. The tiny bubble of laughter becomes the sea of mirth, becomes absolutely still. And in that stillness, everything is understood. This is where the Bhagavad Gita, the yogi sits, in there's no wind, there's no sound, and it sounds small, smaller than this creation, until you step into it. And then when you step into it, you realize, oh, this is the origin point of all of it. And until that strange paradox is resolved in confusion, it is resolved in experience, then we just spin through this world. I was very struck by Tandava singing that song about death, which the origin point of that song, which is known but not by everyone. Swamiji actually had a vision, a visitation. He only explained it a little bit, but he said he saw and heard a teenage boy who died in the Holocaust, who died in a concentration camp, and that boy sang that song to Swami. It was his song. Just the cup of life just barely sipped, and now it's going to be taken away. But then there was that revelation, see? The darkness takes away the day, and then the dawn takes away the night. And so who is to say which is the real one? And see how the gypsy camp of death, it comes and it camps, but then it's gone. All of us, this is this strange world we're thinking of. And right now, partly because of the intense COVID epidemic in India, where many of us have many friends, and all of a sudden this pandemic has moved through Ananda in that country in a way that it hadn't before. So many of us have now know more people who have died, or people whose husbands or children or parents have died. It's touched it a lot stronger. And within our own community, the sister of a longtime member died yesterday, Terry Hubert, for those of you who know her, peacefully and beautifully. And we have another sister, Uma, who's also entered into hospice. So these are things that we're all really thinking about. And here we are, just the gypsy wagon has arrived. It's taking our friends away. And people think, and this is something I've never quite been able to find my way around, so I'm just going to put it here for all of us, our contemplation. We always think that the miracle is that I will be allowed to stay in my body. But maybe the miracle is that I get to leave it. Miracle means something happens that is outside the control or the thought of the ordinary way of being. After lunch, after service, I can decide to go out and have lunch. It's just quite within me. But I'm not going to be able to decide to leave my body right after lunch. It's just not going to happen. And I'm not going to be able to see my friends who are on the brink of dying and make them well again. But why is not, so therefore, being taken out of our body is just as much of a miracle, isn't it? It happens sometimes when we do not anticipate it and we do not want it. We define a miracle as something that pleases our egoic self. But is that really the criteria that we want to use for what is good? Here we are back to good old Adam and Eve. At the center is the knowledge of what is truly good and what is truly evil. Very often what we think of as good is very simple. At least I'm willing to say it. Good is what is easy and pleasurable. That's a pretty clear and simple definition, don't you think so? And bad is what breaks my heart. But I certainly have to grudgingly admit that a lot of what was bad, weirdly, turned out to be good. Oh dear, how do I ever make this tidy? Well, what happens is it all resolves in the stillness of the divine, doesn't it? That we just suddenly are somewhere. And, I love reading these death and return stories where people are catapulted out of their bodies for one reason or another, and then they're startled to find that they're still there. Right after my mother died, as it happened, I left on a Sunday for Europe to visit Swami, and my mother died. She was ill, and I won't say the death was unexpected, but it came without much of an announcement. She was just there and then she wasn't. My sister called me and said, Mom died this morning. And she had Parkinson's and her body wasn't working. And my first response was, good for her, which meant good for her. She's just was willing to just step out of that body when it was done for her. Good for her. So I'm talking to Swami a little bit because I had to decide whether to go back to America, which I didn't. It was fine. I didn't come back. Swami said to me like this, nothing happens when you die. And then he said it again, nothing happens. He said, you're still there. And that's what startles people when they die and return, is that they've had it in their head that something was going to happen, but nothing happens. You just walk, as many say, you walk from one room to another. So you have changed rooms. You've changed costumes. You've changed a lot of things that we thought were required, but nothing else has happened because all we are is that center energy. So what is the origin point of all our fears? What is the origin of all our anxieties, our nervousness? And God knows I've got plenty of that. The loving word I've always used is high-strung, but that's not really what I mean, But I've had to really ask myself that question over and over and over and over again. Why? Why? Do I actually think anything that happens could happen outside of God's loving will for us? Can I take some little piece of my life with a pair of scissors? Everything is an act of divine love except this. And I'm just going to take this little postage stamp out of something that I think is bad because it's neither easy nor pleasurable and say everything else out there is happening by the will of God, but not this. This is a mistake. some error has been made somewhere in the process. Most people don't come to this church. Most people don't read Autobiography of a Yogi. Most people don't practice Kriya because this is such a challenging teaching. And we have to be nice to ourselves. We have to recognize this is a big mountain we're trying to climb. But once it begins to occur to you that this is what I'm really looking for, then, well, for one thing, God will never let you go after that. We ourselves, as Master put it, once you've tasted nectar, when people hand you, he always called it stale cheese. Do you ever think about cheese going stale? Well, I have to just change the subject completely. We were talking about, those of us who are of a certain chronological age, we're talking about the candid camera television show that used to be on, where they would go around and they would play pranks on people, and then they would film it, and then they would say, "Smile, you're on candid camera," and they'd realize that they'd been tricked in this. And there was this one where they used a female, and she was a ditzy female. She would pull into the gas station at the time when the people used to come out, and "What can I do for you, ma'am?" She would say, "Could you change the air in my tires? It's going stale. Could you change it for me? I can just feel it. The air is stale." And then, and she tried a few times and no one would do it. And she finally got some guy to say, "Okay, I'll flatten all your tires and I'll fill them all up again." It's just so ridiculous. I love when people just take things to the nth and just make it as silly as it can be. But anyway, the phrase I've heard was stale cheese, which I've read multiple times. Moldy cheese, rotten cheese, old cheese. The editor never sleeps, the stale. But once you have had an experience of true freedom and true bliss, some part of you always thinks, this is nice, but... And it's not that there's anything wrong. I mean, there's lots of lovely things, but there's always a piece of us. It's like a pulse. It's like the tambura in the Indian music. It's always playing. And even if the melody and the rhythm goes in all these directions, there's this constant. This is the Om vibration. This is the silent voice of God. Oh, what are you doing? Really? You think this is bliss? Let me tell you what real bliss is. And then we turn to Kali. She cuts us to pieces and she blesses us. Just all at the same time. And death comes and death goes, and birth starts, and death comes and death goes. The whole thing is a miracle, really. And some of it we call bad, some of it we call good, but all of it is just playing this incredible long story. And this is our job. This is our destiny. This is our joy. This is our suffering, all of it. We're just in this very, very long story that was not written by us, playing a part that we chose, but I don't remember choosing it anymore. That just is just now. And the more we can go into that promised inner kingdom of our own awareness, of our own divinity, that's what God is offering us. I remember at the end of Swami's life, and we went through a lot of stuff before we got to the end of his life. I mean, he did, certainly, and I went through a lot of it with him, either close up or at a distance. And at the end, all he could say, just all the time, so much bliss. And he would weep, and he would lose the ability to speak. Sometimes I feel so much bliss, he would say, and then tears. I just don't know what to do with myself. And that's the end of the story. And we will persevere to the end because we have no choice. We can resign, but our resignation is not accepted. We've gotten on the train. And Divine Mother's going to take us where she knows we really want to go. God bless you.